Hello and welcome to WaterNow's virtual town hall with U.S. Congressman Jared Huffman discussing COVID-19 relief and water infrastructure legislation. I'm Cynthia Kohler, WaterNow's Executive Director. Before we get started, I'd like to share some instructions with you for asking questions. We'll be holding them till the end of the webinar, but you can submit your questions throughout the webinar using the question and answer function shown here on your screen. Please provide your name, organization, and your question as succinctly as possible. And we apologize in advance if we can't get to all of the questions. We'd also like to make sure that you fill out our evaluation near the end of the webinar. That helps us make sure that everything we're providing to you is as useful as possible. Okay, it's time for us to get underway. We are delighted and honored to have with us today U.S. Congressmember Jared Huffman, representing California's 2nd Congressional District, including my hometown here in Northern California. Jared has been a leader in the water space for many years. He chairs the Natural Resources Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife with jurisdiction over federal water projects, fisheries management, and many other issues. He also serves on the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure and the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. The Congress previously served for 8 years in the California Assembly, where he was instrumental in enacting some of the most significant state water reform legislation in decades. And just to share with you a Huffman fun fact, in college at UC Santa Barbara, the congressman was a 3-time NCAA All-American volleyball player and went on to play for the US volleyball team in 1987 when the team was ranked #1 in the world. Of particular interest to many of you participating in this webinar may be that the congressman also served for 12 years on the board of our local water provider. In the interest of full disclosure, I've been a member of that same board for the last 15 years and had the opportunity to serve with Mr. Huffman before he went on to bigger things. Welcome, Congressman. And I'd like to start by thanking you for your service and tireless support for our local communities and firefighters over the last weeks as we've struggled with record-breaking fires here in California.
Well, thank you, Cynthia. Thanks for all of your water leadership. You've had an amazing career in water, including your service on the Marin Municipal Water District Board. Fun fact about that, many people don't realize that the Marin Municipal Water District was the very first municipal water district in the state of California, the first one to be organized under a new law 100 or so years ago. But thank you for pulling this together, and I'm so impressed. It feels just like one of these big water conferences that we might all attend in normal times, except that, you know, we're all below the waist, we're all wearing sweatpants and flip-flops. So it's great to be with you. Great job pulling together a terrific group of participants. I'm looking forward to participating.
Great. Let's get to it. Our first question for you is just big picture. There's been a lot of activity in the House around COVID-19 pandemic, the pandemic and federal relief. Information has been somewhat confusing about what is or is not being made available to cities, towns, and water utilities to make sure that they're continuing to provide these most essential of services: drinking water, wastewater, stormwater management. We're hearing about various vehicles: the HEROES Act, the Moving Forward Act, the Future Act, WRDA, appropriations bills. We'll be getting into each of them. But to start us off, can you provide your high-level perspective on the aspects of these bills that you see as most relevant to local decision makers and utilities?
Yeah, so it's a great question because there are a lot of moving parts right now. And each of those parts, I think, is really significant. The HEROES Act was passed actually 100 days ago yesterday. And it's big, $3.5 trillion, sorry. I mean, when we're talking numbers that big, sometimes you forget to use the T. Yeah, it's $3.5 trillion. And it not only attempts to address the public health crisis and the pandemic in really important ways by getting to the end of this dysfunction we see with testing and with the stockpiling of PPEs and other things, but it also critically provides relief to state and local governments to the tune of about $1 trillion. And does a lot more than that: postal service and other pieces, hunger, nutrition assistance. We knew 100 days ago that we were going to need something of this magnitude to truly respond to what was coming. And I think our problem is for 100 days, it's really been the sound of one hand clapping. We finally had our Republican colleagues come back to us with some half measures that don't even begin to approach the problem. They include nothing for state and local governments. So we're a long way from a deal. And in fact, even on the unemployment insurance, which sort of politically was the most compelling thing that was, you would think would move people to the table, the loss of that additional $600 weekly benefit, they don't seem to be particularly motivated. So I wish I had better news for you, but at least that part of all of these legislative responses seems pretty far from a deal. In the meantime, that huge $3.5 trillion package that we passed out of the House, we knew that even that wasn't really enough to respond to the economic downturn and the other challenge that we're going to see from this pandemic. And so this was an important sort of forcing moment for us. As long as I've been in Congress, we've been talking about infrastructure. Everybody says they want to do infrastructure. I've lost count of how many times President Trump declared infrastructure week. But nothing ever comes of it. Everyone could always find reasons not to move the bill forward to an actual vote. Well, we finally did move a really big and bold infrastructure bill to a vote on the floor of the House of Representatives, and we passed it. The core of it was, this is the Moving Forward Act. The core of it was a surface transportation reauthorization, and you know that we're just a month away from the current surface transportation authorization expiring. So this is timely, but we added a whole bunch of other really robust investments to that, including My Future Drought Act, which, thank you, Water Now has been very supportive. Many of your participants have been very supportive, but a big water infrastructure piece in the Moving Forward Act. Also, you know, clean vehicles for our postal service, broadband, all sorts of other components to the infrastructure fix. And I just included in that my mention of the Future Act, which you had asked about. So that is my water infrastructure answer. We can talk a little more about that when you want. And then the last piece of all these moving parts to try to track, and it's a little dizzying, is WRDA, the Water Resource Development Act. That's, of course, the piece of water that lives with the Army Corps of Engineers. And, you know, this is a bill that does manage, even in today's politics, to get done somehow every couple of years. And we are on track, I think, to do that again. We've passed a really good WRDA out of the House. I think it can get over the finish line, even in these dysfunctional politics that we're living through. But that's sort of the mix of bills. Add on to that now the layer of appropriation season, because as you know, the fiscal year for our federal government starts October 1. That means the clock is ticking on getting all of these agencies funded through the appropriations bills. We've been dutifully passing most of them out of the House, but there hasn't been a lot of action in the Senate. And we are heading to one of those great impasses that have become sort of the norm these days. Whether that will result in, you know, a big omnibus or some kind of a flatline continuing resolution of current funding, or something in between. Sometimes we call them mini buses, where you'll take a cluster of agencies and cut a deal on funding for them, and then kind of a continuing resolution flatline for other agencies. I have no idea. The politics are fascinating right now, and that's probably a euphemism, because it's really quite frustrating and dysfunctional. But that's a long answer to your first question, Cynthia.
It was perfect. I think everybody was really hungering for that kind of overview. So thank you for that. So building on that and all of these different vehicles, all of these moving parts, you know, if you could just be the decider, you know, what would be your priorities for a final stimulus package? Granted, you're not going to be able to get it all. You know, what do you think are the most important things from a water utility, city, town, you know, water resource service agencies? You know, what would be your priorities for a final stimulus package?
Holy cow, that is really tough to try to choose from among these priorities, because yeah, it would be great. As a water manager, it would be great to have the opportunity to draw down some funding for capital projects that I'd like to undertake. And so the infrastructure package is really appealing, but you've got a whole bunch of customers that are struggling to pay their bills right now. And the individual assistance that we're providing in some of the pandemic response legislation would be pretty darn important to helping people keep the lights on and keep their bills paid. So I don't know. I kind of say all of them. I'm not sure that you can pick any one of these things apart and say that it's the most important. And I think our challenge right now, we've got one of those moments where you really do have to do all of this stuff. And right now, and I apologize, if you don't like politics, you should turn away right now and mute your computer, but I'm going to be a little political. The Trump administration right now, in our negotiations, such as they are, there's not a whole lot happening, but they're led by a chief of staff, Mark Meadows, who was my colleague for 7+ years. He is the architect of the 35-day government shutdown. He's the guy that led the Freedom Caucus to literally turn out the lights on government because they were mad that they lost the midterm election. So I'm not optimistic that we're going to get to much of this pressing to-do list, let alone all of it, which I think we need to do until after the election and probably until after January.
Got it. Well, with that, we're going to still press ahead just in case, and we do have the future to look forward to. The HEROES Act and some of the other bills that are floating around includes a moratorium on water shutoffs for non-payment of bills, which makes a lot of sense given the current economic circumstances. People are struggling. The flip side, of course, is that utilities need revenue to keep the water, and other water services functioning and flowing. Do you see a likelihood of federal legislation providing support to cities and utilities to address those particular challenges, given what you've just said, at some point?
So cities would certainly benefit from the local government assistance that we've provided in the HEROES Act. There's no specific dedicated utility assistance at this point. That's something we can certainly continue to work on. But there is in the HEROES Act $1.5 billion in funding for water ratepayer assistance, recognizing that people were going to have a hard time paying their bills. And then I believe it's about $375 billion that would be distributed out to municipalities to pick up revenue shortfalls from the pandemic. So it's probably not everything that water utilities would like to see right now, but I think there's some significant support there. And then the infrastructure piece of what we've talked about, the Moving Forward Act, that's where you really get into some nice dollars. But again, on the capital side, $40 billion for wastewater infrastructure, $25 billion for drinking water. I think all of that is critical. There's a long overdue reform on tax parity for water conservation that some, I think, of your participants have been working with me for years. So lots of financial support in those various ways, and an opportunity to continue working on it perhaps after January if we get some changes in government.
Do you have a view, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but there's been a lot of conversation about a federal moratoria on shutoffs. Do you have a view on that one way or another? I know that's not your committee's jurisdiction, but I know you've been in and out of these issues for a long time.
Well, we are providing protections like that against evictions and foreclosures. So, it's somewhat consistent with the type of provisions that we put in place in other areas. If we're going to do that, I think it's really important that we recognize that someone has to pick up the slack, and we need to provide the financial assistance. In your case, of course, it's the water utility. So I think it would need to be paired with that type of support on the other side of that policy.
Got it. So you mentioned briefly the future Water Infrastructure and Drought Resiliency Act. I know that's a big priority of yours, very ambitious proposal providing, I think you said $3.5 billion for water infrastructure and drought resiliency. What do you see the specific ways in which that bill, should it ever move down the road, in terms of local governments and its prospect, and how it will potentially impact local water utility operations and efforts?
Yeah, I think this is a bill that should really appeal to individual water districts, to regional water collaborations. For this reason, what we've tried to kind of take a look at the historic mission of the Bureau of Reclamation, which in the past has been to provide Western states with the support they need to meet their water needs according to the best science and innovation of the time. Well, we now have all sorts of better tools than we used to have. And some of the old strategies that the Bureau has pursued are less effective because, as you know, you can only build so many big dams. You do hit a point where you're just spending an awful lot of money to not generate very much water yield. And so we took a look at what has been happening in California and around the West at the local and regional levels where folks have had to innovate. And we're not saying that there can be no new big dams and storage, but we are broadening out the eligibility for those type of projects. And a lot of smaller local and regional projects are going to be eligible under our bill for storage funding in ways that they would not in prior efforts to tackle this problem. I've seen too many times where just a small number of very large projects that are sort of politically favored by some powerful interests get all the attention. And everyone else is sort of on their own, even if they've got great multi-benefit local regional projects. So we have really broadened that to include, we throw a lot of money at storage in this bill, but it includes things like watershed enhancements that can improve the yield of existing storage. It includes groundwater recharge. It includes storage projects that integrate water recycling, desalination. So I think a lot of the participants on this call are going to, when they see this bill, and many have already supported the bill for this very reason, but when they see it, I think they're going to be excited about the possibility of finally getting some federal funding for projects that can do good things in their area and provide wet water, which is really, you know, what we're after when we talk about resiliency in the West.
Absolutely. So building on that, one thing that we work on a lot at Water Now, and I know has been, you know, you've been a champion of really innovative options for addressing water infrastructure, because at the end of the day, it's not so much, you know, what it is, but how it functions. So can you talk a little bit about how the Future Act would support those kinds of, you know, things like you've touched on some of them, you know, watershed protection. This is, you know, there's becoming more and more documentary evidence that investing in source water control and watershed health actually increases supply, treats water, you know, more cheaply than more conventional centralized infrastructure. In addition, of course, water use efficiency, more and more we're seeing communities across the country, not just in the West, saying that their cheapest water supply dollar is actually their conservation dollar, and that green infrastructure is really has multiple benefits and many opportunities to serve the same functions as, you know, in a distributed sense as more centralized conventional stormwater infrastructure. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about the opportunities in water innovation.
Well,
you know,
that's what this bill is all about. And I have to say the reason I think this bill is responsive to that is because we've spent several years almost crowdsourcing feedback from water managers all over the West and all over the country to a large degree. We did it in response to the drought of 2015. And again, what has motivated me here is that I have tired of fighting the last water war every single year. So many people just think that tackling Western water means pitting farmers against fish and fighting the same battles over the Endangered Species Act. And there's just so much that we can actually do if we get past that. So that's what we tried to do. And we've done an even newer iteration of that with this year's Drought Future Act. So thank you for, I mean, hundreds, thousands, I think, of comments that we've received and tried to really think about and integrate. And a lot of the participants of this call have really helped us get our heads around what the bill ought to look like. But it will include, you know, breathing new life into Title 16. You've got so many shovel-ready water recycling projects. Southern California is just chock full of them, but many other places around the West, they're ready to go. They're incredible resources in terms of resiliency and drought proofing. They have multiple benefits, as you know, for clean water. They create jobs. They just make sense on every single level. And they take pressure off of these hammered, fragile estuaries like the Delta and a lot of our river systems. So we need a lot more of that. We include a bill from Grace Napolitano. She's been a real champion on this. In our bill, we include a desalination bill from Mike Levin of Orange County. There's a lot of innovation right now. Desal's not going to make sense everywhere, but in places where you've sort of exhausted a lot of your other alternatives and you can creatively address the intake and the discharge issues, desal will make sense, and the costs are coming down. So we want to accelerate that transformation to affordable, sustainable desal. And then clean drinking water in places like the southern San Joaquin Valley. You know, if ever there's a place that has acute environmental justice needs that seem to just be forgotten in these water war fights over the Endangered Species Act, it is the southern San Joaquin Valley. And so we have a bill from TJ Cox to really go big on disadvantaged communities that, you know, are sometimes used as props in these water fights, but people aren't bringing solutions and clean drinking water to these communities. And we think it's time to do that.
So you've touched on an issue that is so important, not just to Water Now, but you know, to almost everybody that we're talking to these days, and that's water equity. And I know that's an issue that has been close to your heart for a long time. And while I'm hearing that these bills may not fully address that, it's exciting to hear that these issues about ensuring not just drinking water access, but sanitation, you know, stormwater flooding often hits communities of color and, you know, disadvantaged families much more, you know, much harder than others. Are you seeing more of an appetite for addressing these issues head on in the current conversations?
Well, I think we are, and I'm really pleased to have a partner representing the San Joaquin Valley right now who's not interested in fighting the last water war, who's interested in bringing clean drinking water to disadvantaged communities, just like what you described. So I think TJ Cox has brought a breath of fresh air to this issue. He's thinking big, and we're going to try to deliver some clean water to the people in his district. That's
great. So related, some of these, part of what's brought along when we're doing innovation is new partners, right? A lot of the innovations do involve distributed systems over communities, green stormwater infrastructure, for example. That's all about using your community as, you know, a whole, you know, water, stormwater capture opportunity. Same for water use efficiency. It really is, you know, all businesses, industries, commercial, industrial, institutional, and residential spaces. And what's been a problem for utilities in that regard is that, you know, who pays for that and how do you pay for that? And while this is a technical issue, I thought I'd ask you about something that you've championed for some time, which is rebates, right? I mean, the way that a lot of these distributed, decentralized solutions move forward is through rebates, but past a certain point, utilities are reluctant to issue rebates of large scale, because then you get into an issue of whether or not that's income that's taxable, and people are, you know, feel that they're being penalized. And for a long, long time, you've really been at the forefront at the state and federal level on trying to create, I should say, clarity that rebates for essentially water infrastructure should not be taxed as income. And I know that's been a frustrating fight for you, but I also note that you've been able to get this measure into at least one of the bills moving forward. What do you think about the prospect?
Yeah, so this is a frustrating challenge for water districts, I'm sure, because these rebates are a really important tool to do many of the things that you just mentioned, from low flow toilet retrofits to other water use efficiency initiatives. And the IRS threw us a curveball a few years ago by coming out with a ruling that said that we're going to start treating this as taxable income. So people are a lot less interested in participating in a rebate program if it's going to give them tax headaches. And I tried behind the scenes during the Obama administration to get the IRS turned around. We tried legislatively. I was initially working as a co-author with Dana Rohrabacher of Orange County, a bipartisan bill that we tried to move, and we were unable to do it. So this year, finally, we do have it attached to the Moving Forward Act. It did move out of the House of Representatives. I know we've got folks on the Ways and Means Committee, which is the tax writing committee where these kind of things have to be worked out, that are now quite well aware of this and quite supportive of the fix that we have been pushing. I wish we could have done it many years ago, but I think the next best thing is to, you know, try to do it now, even in the lame duck, or maybe even, you know, in January, the worst case. But I think we've done a good job of raising the profile of this little technical issue that is a real big deal to water districts, and I'm pretty optimistic that we're nearing the point where we can fix it.
I'm delighted to hear that. And then shifting back to a conversation we had just a minute ago, there has been we've talked a lot about providing support to utilities around the idea of shutoffs, keeping their revenue strong, but what about low income assistance, right? I mean, there's more and more studies indicating that even as water rates go up, which they need to do, right? I mean, we need to be paying into our systems so that we can keep them updated, we can keep our infrastructure safe and healthy, but that can have a very disproportionate impact on lower income communities and of course communities of color. There's been a lot of discussion about potentially a water program modeled on LIHEAP, the low income home energy assistance program that's been in place for many years. Now I know this is not fair, this is outside of your committee's jurisdiction, but as a representative with longstanding interest in equity and access, what are your thoughts about a water LIHEAP? Do you see some type of program like that? Or is that really what you were talking about in Mr. Cox's bill?
Well, it's a little bit different than the Cox bill, but look, I have supported LIHEAP. If there's an opportunity to do something on water that is similar to that, I would be very supportive of it just because of the equity. But this is an opportunity to explain to folks who may be confused just how balkanized the issue of water is within the United States Congress. So I chair the Water, Oceans, and Wildlife Committee, which sounds like I got all the water, right? But I don't. I have sort of Western water. I have the environmental side of water, the things that the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Reclamation work on, things that are covered, with our public lands and our environmental agencies that, well, not even all environmental agencies, because EPA and Clean Drinking Water and utilities are over in the Energy and Commerce Committee. And that's where the LIHEAP issue that you're asking about will be considered and deliberated. But that's not all, because you've got the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee that deals with the Corps of Engineers and that part of water. And then you've got the Department of Agriculture, believe it or not, that has some rural drinking water pieces. So, it would be really nice if we could figure out a way to consolidate water policy making more, both among the various federal agencies and within the Congress. But right now, unfortunately, folks that work on water kind of have to understand all these different, sometimes competing and conflicting ways in which water policy gets considered.
Got it. Turning back to a couple of the other bills, and we'll get to questions that are coming in just a minute. You mentioned the Water Resources Development Act, known as WRDA. We're hearing that there may be some connection right now between WRDA and the state revolving funds. Of course, as you know, there are two of them that are so important to cities, towns, and utilities. That seemed a little unusual to us. Can you speak to that at all?
So I don't know what's going on in the Senate. WRDA in the past has sometimes become one of these end-of-year must-pass bills that sweeps in other stuff. You may remember a few years ago, Barbara Boxer at the time was chairing the Senate committee, author of the WRDA reauthorization, had put in a tremendous amount of time into developing a really good WRDA bill. But over in the House, we desperately wanted to include Flint drinking water, the city of Flint with its lead contamination issues. And in the Senate, Senator Feinstein and Kevin McCarthy in the House really wanted to take a bite out of the Endangered Species Act and do some things that I did not support and Barbara Boxer did not support. And WRDA kind of got hijacked and turned into, one of these Christmas trees that did all kinds of interesting things at the end of session. Barbara Boxer ended up voting against her own bill as one of her final votes in the United States Senate. So I can't tell you necessarily how WRDA is going to unfold in the final days of a crazy session. I can just tell you that I am in a little better position in the year 2020 to try to keep bad stuff out of that kind of bill. And if we have an opportunity to do good things for the state revolving fund, I will try to make that happen.
Great. So you mentioned at the top of the hour the appropriations bills for fiscal year 2021, and it's a little unclear what's going to happen in the Senate, or entirely unclear. Assuming that there's a continuing resolution, which is I think where you're suggesting things are going. And again, I'm asking you to prognosticate with your crystal ball. What do you think about the chances for SRF funding in a continuing resolution?
Well, CRs are typically, flatline continuations of existing funding. So I don't know that that bodes well for what we need. I think we almost certainly are headed to a continuing resolution just based on the trajectory of the politics and all these different things that are colliding right now, and the election, of course, hanging out there over everybody's head. But it may be one of these CRs that gives way to an omnibus and a deal of some kind shortly after the election. So my crystal ball's kind of on the fritz on this one.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people's crystal balls on the fritz right now. It's an unusual moment that we find ourselves in. But speaking of that, what would be your water infrastructure priorities for the first 100 days for the next administration, however the election turns out?
Yeah, so I'm excited about that because we passed this Moving Forward Act out of the House of Representatives, and I think that now becomes the policy marker or the floor for what we need to do going forward. And the great news there is it's big and it's bold and it's really good. So my policy priority will be picking up right where we left off with this bill that's already passed the House of Representatives. And I think we're going to have a lot of support. My crystal ball does foretell a Democratic Senate. So some of your, listener, write that down. I think we're going to have a Democratic Senate.
You're first.
And I think there's going to be a lot of support for the kind of infrastructure package that we've already passed out of the House.
Okay. That's interesting. So one thing that, and this might be a bit of a curveball, one thing that we talk about a lot at Water Now, we work with a lot of water tech, water innovators, and they're very hungry for the opportunity to do more with local utilities who, as you probably are aware, at this point, the federal share of support for local water infrastructure has declined dramatically from the 70s, 80s, and even the 90s. And at this point, 95% of all local water infrastructure is paid for one way or another by local ratepayers, who also, of course, have to repay SRF funds. Given that it's challenging for utilities to move in these new and exciting directions, to really invest in water tech because of the risks. Do you see that, again, looking towards the 100 days that you were just describing, opportunities on the federal side for guidelines to be a little more flexible, a little bit more innovative themselves, right? Because these programs have been in place for a long time and we're used to funding certain things with them. What do you think are the opportunities? And do you think there's a role for Congress in opening some of those programs to support utilities and water technologies and moving in these more innovative directions without all of the risk falling on local ratepayers who are already so burdened?
Yeah, well, obviously, I want to hear more about the specific ways in which existing financing models are too restricted. But we've tried to work on creative financing with you and other things that can be responsive to that. And I don't think we'll ever get to the point where the federal government is just handing operating dollars to water districts. But I think we certainly want to leverage local investments in the kind of innovation that you're referring to, and that is the intention behind certainly everything I put into the Drought Future Act. It's the intention, I think, of the way the SRF was supposed to work. So we'll work together, and I think we can find a way to make a lot of that happen.
Great. So we have a fair amount of time and a fair number of questions from our participants. So maybe we'll turn to those. Our first question comes from Pat Showalter, a Water Now Alliance Leadership Council member and former member of, or mayor actually, of Mountain View, California. And she's asking, what has the congressman heard from your constituents, either utilities, or ratepayers, about the problems that they're having around water during COVID?
I don't hear a lot specifically about water. I'm hearing from people that are very worried about their ability to keep their homes, to their ability to pay their rent. And I'm sure that paying their water bill is kind of caught up in that general hardship of just paying all their bills and keeping things afloat. But I suspect Cynthia Kohler here is hearing much more directly from people about, what part of this hardship the MMWD water bill means, because, water's not exactly cheap here in Marin County. And this is certainly forcing some very tough choices on people. You should never have to choose between paying your water bill and putting food on the table. So it's just a really tough time for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think our water district, like many others, have certainly we are, voluntarily, putting off any water shutoffs at all. And of course, like many water utilities around the country, they're putting off or eliminating entirely planned rate increases. So it's, I think there's responsiveness, but there's also the bill is going to come due at some point. So yeah, that circles us back to the availability of federal relief to get those organizations past that. Another question is from Jack Gorman from New York at the other end of the country. And this is a question that my team is telling me a lot of people have submitted. Do you see any money included in any of the water infrastructure bills for replacing lead service lines in various municipalities? This is such an important issue, and it gets to the discussion we had a little earlier about distributed and decentralized water infrastructure. It's one thing for utilities to pay for those service lines when they are utilities lines. The challenge is when they're on private property. And in many communities across the country, that's not considered infrastructure at all. That's considered the problem of the business, the institution, or the homeowner.
Yeah, so a couple thoughts about that. I don't think there's anything specific in the legislation we've discussed on the customer side of those lead laterals. But I will say this: if you wanted to, as a water district, put a program together to incentivize customers to do this, you certainly don't want a rebate or some other mechanism to be taxable to the customer. So I think this fix that we're talking about to the water conservation rebate taxation would also be applicable to any kind of incentives that you want to bring on the customer side of that lead lateral challenge. And then broadly, I would think that a whole bunch of the clean drinking water funding that we are putting on the table would be available to water districts to spend as they choose to address water quality issues, even on the customer side of that equation. But specifically, I'm going to need to go back and check it. I would think programmatically you would have support and resources to do some of these things we're talking about.
Yeah, I would think so. I would hope so. We hadn't seen it specifically in some of the bills, but it's such a big issue, particularly in the East, in the older communities. And more and more cities are beginning to understand that this really is not a problem that should be considered the homeowner's problem. I don't think I'm giving anything away by saying that we're chatting with Denver Water, one of the largest utilities in the country, about a plan that they're developing now to replace all of the private lead service line replacements in their community, really taking on ownership for that in a way that, is extraordinarily admirable. So, yeah. So
to our friend from New York, if I could, Cynthia,
of course.
I'm having a memory of my days in the state legislature in California, where we tried to address the issue of failing sewer laterals on the customer side. And we passed a law to make it clear that you could use a pre-abatement law that would create some financing options. It basically would allow wastewater districts to go in and update the customer side laterals and then put it onto the property assessment as part of a nuisance abatement. And that sounds really technical and wonky, but it's basically a way to make it more affordable to allow homeowners to deduct the cost of these investments as part of their property. And there may be a way to do that with lead laterals for drinking water too.
Okay, very interesting. So moving to Colorado, we have a question from a former mayor of Littleton and a Water Now member who's saying that water and wildfires are a priority in the West. We've been talking a lot about the West. How do you find, given your situation as chair of the subcommittee, really engaging representatives and senators from the more populated eastern part of the United States to address these issues? Not a lot of wildfires in, New York.
No, there's not, but there is a lot of extreme weather. And, we've seen even with if I'm pronouncing it right, the derecho in Iowa, basically an inland hurricane. We're sort of all in it together when it comes to these climate change related extreme weather events. And that's how I invite my colleagues from outside of the West to see this. Right now, just to give you a sense of what's going on in Northern California, we've got over 1 million acres burning as we speak. That is more just in the last 2 weeks that has burned than we've seen in any fire year in California. So the scale of this is extreme. In Sonoma County, I have a fire that's burning right down to the banks of Lake Sonoma, which is part of a critical water supply resource. And there's a lot of concern that if that spreads out of control, it could carbonize the water. And because of the way we treat water out of that system, that's a big problem. We don't have the kind of water treatment facilities that many of you on this call probably have. So it does affect water utilities and water service. It affects all of us, and it affects you no matter what part of the country you're in. And that's how I urge people to see it as part of this, common exposure that we have to extreme weather and the need for resilience.
Scott Werner, who's a hydrologist here in California, is asking, how are tribal communities reflected in the infrastructure and relief conversations?
So what we're trying to do whenever we do bills like this is to include tribal set-asides, whether it's transportation or broadband or drinking water or housing. What we have heard, and I represent a lot of Indian country, what we've heard is that you really want to have tribal set-asides. And we've done that even in the CARES Act and some of our pandemic response. I've been pleased to see that we're pretty consistently reflecting that need for specific tribal programs, and we're going to continue to do that.
Great. One question that has come in now, your committee does deal, as you mentioned, with the natural resources end of things. Given the extreme needs, given the financial challenges, what is the role of, what is the best way to be dealing with the ecosystem at this point? Is protecting fisheries a luxury that we just don't really have the capacity to address right now, given the extremity of the needs and, the expense and all of these problems that we're talking about? What is the best way to address, those ecosystem needs at this moment?
Well, it may depend on the particular ecosystem challenge that we're talking about, but we could fill up an entire conversation, I think, with this topic. I don't subscribe to this notion that we have to choose between the ecosystem and responding to climate emergencies or other challenges. In fact, right now as we speak, the Trump administration is trying to rush forward an oil lease sale in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. A terrible idea for the environment. It would be awful for one of the most pristine places on Earth, but also really bad for climate change. It will make all of these things we're talking about worse if we continue to extract and burn all these fossil fuel reserves. So I think the answer to that in many other cases is one and the same. We need to protect those environmental resources, and that will lead us to better energy policies and other policies. I'm certainly not ready to give up on salmon and cold water fisheries and other things in the state of California. And it really is a false choice if you look at something like the Klamath River, where you've got 4 really obsolete hydroelectric dams that need to come out and that should come out. We have an agreement to take them out. We don't need that power. It's fungible. It's a very small amount of power. The cost of modernizing and upgrading those dams far exceeds the utility of the hydropower they generate. But by taking them out, we can do a really good thing to a river that's been hammered, to downstream communities of color tribes, struggling salmon fisheries, commercial fisheries, recreational. So, I'm not ready to buy into this you've got to choose mode. And let's even go to the Delta, which is the largest source of water where sometimes these conflicts play out. If you want to look ahead to a future of sea level rise and climate impacts, the Delta is not a smart place to depend on for your water supply. Put aside how you may feel about the Delta smelt or salmon and other ecosystem values. It is going to be a heck of a fragile place to depend on, especially with a far-flung water diversion and transmission system in the age of climate change. So these things we've been talking about, local solutions, stormwater capture, groundwater recharge, desal recycling, those are a far better bet, and they don't present the same environmental conflicts and trade-offs.
Perfect. A related question comes from Friends of the River in California, maybe putting a positive spin on this issue. How do the water infrastructure bills help protect rivers and in-stream flows?
Yeah, well, by taking pressure off all of these hammered ecosystems. Again, even if you just looked at it from the cold-blooded water delivery perspective, I want wet water for my customers. A lot of these old, far-flung diversion and transmission schemes are really risky and unreliable in the age of climate change and rising sea level and extreme weather events. And so the more you can control your own destiny with local and regional water supplies and efficiency, of course, to knock that demand down so that you're only trying to find the water you need and not wasting water, it is just a far better response to this moment, and it takes pressure off of these hammered rivers and estuaries.
Got it. Shifting a little bit back to the legislation, this is a question from the American Waterworks Association in Washington. The CARES Act had a specific prohibition against using any of those funds to offset lost utility revenues. The HEROES Act does not appear to have that, but we know historically that money flows from the water department to City Hall and not the other way around. I'm just reading this question. What can Congress do to make sure that water utilities have a decent shot at obtaining relief funds? I know we've talked a lot about this so far, but do you feel that you can address the AWDA's question sort of specifically?
Yeah, I mean, taking away the prohibition, is a step in the right direction. So I think the HEROES Act probably reflects about as far as we're going to get on that issue. We can, if there is extreme hardship among water utilities that's not being met by the funding that we send down to state and local governments, I think we should continue to talk about that. But the HEROES Act would help.
Got it. And this is a question from the Water Foundation based here in California. How can we ensure that small, disadvantaged, and rural water systems are able to access funding for safe drinking water or pandemic relief? So you've talked a little bit about this, but this is a little bit more specific.
Yeah, so there are some programs out there that are specifically targeted at really small. Like this is over in the Department of Agriculture. USDA has some of these programs. And we need to push out funding into those as well. But I think take a look at the Drought Futures Act. Take a look at the provision from T.J. Cox that we've got in there about safe drinking water to disadvantaged communities. I think it may be responsive to this question, and probably one of the bigger, more important things that we've done in a long, long time, maybe ever, when it comes to finally meeting these needs in places like California's Central Valley.
I might just take a moment here to plug some of our work at Water Now and make a suggestion to you. One thing we've been doing is helping smaller and mid-sized utilities access Water Smart funding, a great bureau program that in our view is substantially underfunded. But one of the things we found is that even when the funding's there, it doesn't necessarily go to the communities that need it the most because the application process is complex and challenging, and they don't have the resources and expertise they need. We found over the last couple of years that we have almost a 90% success rate that when we work with the community, their application gets funded. So it may be in response to this question that part of what's needed is not just the funds themselves, but the opportunities for NGOs and others like Water Now to really work with those communities, help them get over those hurdles, and really work through the process. Interested?
That's a great point. Yeah, no, certainly the capacity building so that they can effectively compete for these grant funds is a part of it. You're doing great work to make that happen, and we should support that uh, in our programs. But the other is we've always got to be mindful of matching requirements that may
Yeah.
disproportionately freeze out those communities that you're talking about. So I think if you take a look at the TJ Cox bill that we put into the Drought Future Act, we did address that in there and trying to make this funding much more accessible to communities that don't have a lot of capacity.
Yeah, those matching requirements make a lot of sense for certain utilities, but obviously not for the small disadvantaged ones that are really struggling. So here's a question from your alma mater, Marin Water. Energy policy and wildfires are also significant external factors impacting water infrastructure. Have you had conversations with colleagues overseeing the Department of Energy or Department of Interior about funding more incentives for innovative energy and forest health projects with Water Utility Nexus?
Well, there's some great partnerships underway in California to look at that. I don't know if they include. Well, I think the Plumas could be one of the Plumas water utilities is partnering with TNC and others. Again, looking out at meadow restoration, at some forest thinning that leads to healthy forest values, but also enhanced snowpack and water yield. And that is the kind of thing that we do make eligible for funding in my legislation. So I think the answer is yes, to some degree. I don't know in a place like Marin County if any of those strategies are going to make a lot of sense. Probably not a lot of watershed yield enhancement to be done on Mount Tamalpais, but because we don't have a lot of snowpack we're dealing with, but you never know.
Right.
Certainly this Department of Energy and this Department of Interior, they're not great partners on any of this stuff right now. They're interested in fossil fuel energy dominance as the answer to all things. So, but the work is proceeding. And I think with a new administration and a new interest in these kind of strategies, we're going to have some great opportunities starting real soon.
So that might be a good segue to a question from the Marin Climate Action Network. What is the potential for using solar panels on aqueducts, or I guess what do you think is, on aqueducts or storage to address climate change challenges and the intersection of water management?
I think on aqueducts, it makes all kinds of sense. I mean, you've just got a lot of surface area there, and if you can capture energy through photovoltaics while reducing evaporative loss, I mean, it has always made a huge amount of sense. And I've always pushed that for places like the California Aqueduct and Delta Mendota Canal. Now, you do see some proposals once in a while to take photovoltaics, as they sometimes call them, and more broadly spread those over the surface area of lakes and rivers and even the ocean. I think there you get into some more problematic trade-offs because when you're taking away surface area on a place with actual environmental values, that I don't think that's what we're going for. But you asked about canals and aqueducts. That makes all kinds of sense. You probably don't want to put it over Kent Lake or Alpine Lake, but absolutely the California Aqueduct and the DMC, that they should be generating electrons for us.
Got it. And now we have a question from the California-Nevada section of the American Water Works Association. The 2018 Farm Bill put a high priority on source water protection through USDA programs, but those funds have to go to landowners. Can you envision a similar provision through EPA or another agency that would provide financial support for actions by water agencies?
Yeah, I think I'm going to need to get a little more specifics from the questioner on what you're looking for. I am familiar with what we've done through the Farm Bill. I'm not entirely sure how we would go about trying to incentivize water agencies to take action in this space, but I'd love to continue that conversation.
Got it. I think we can make that happen. We can connect you with Tim Worley, the questioner who recently stepped down as the executive director, but we can facilitate that conversation. So I think we have time for one more question. This comes to us from Mike Kasperzak, the past president of the California League of Cities. And that is, how can we as local leaders best engage with Congress on these issues?
Yeah, so local leaders obviously have different associations that have lobbyists and uh, a little bit of clout in Washington, D.C., whether it's the League of Cities or CSAC or your clean water advocates in the water space. There's a whole bunch of urban and wastewater associations that come to town every year. You could join one of those trips. Now, in the pandemic, it's all gone virtual. So, let's hope we can get back to that. But I would say, when it is safe to do so, joining one of those pilgrimages back to Washington, D.C. with your colleagues in the water space and having that direct relationship with the associations and the lobbyists who are back there knocking on doors and meeting with members and pushing this agenda would be really important if you want to get more involved. Obviously, at the district level, know your representative, okay? So if you are in my district and you're a local leader on any of this stuff, we always want to, you'd be surprised at how much representatives want to hear from local leaders in their district. And in fact, these big associations and these trips back to Washington, they tend to divide up, and those from each Congress member's districts are the ones that actually go into those offices for the meetings. And the answer is always yes. We always take those meetings. We always take those phone calls.
So that's a great point, because I think you're right. I think local leaders don't always feel that their voice is heard, which is one of the reasons that Water Now and other organizations do a lot of these sign-on letters. So, in this moment of COVID and given the challenges with travel, how helpful do you find that kind of thing, hearing, getting letters with, local utility leaders, signing on and, providing you with recommendations? To what extent is that valuable to you?
Well, it's more important, Cynthia, because the traditional line of communication, I've just sort of come to assume that a couple times a year I'm going to have these water meetings back in Washington, and right now I'm not. They're not happening. So, your ability to convene water leaders becomes even more important in a moment like this, because it's one of the only ways that we can hear from people.
Great. Well, I think we've got a couple of just wrap-ups here. I want to thank you, Congressman, for your extraordinary participation today. It is always a pleasure to hear your insights and your passion for these issues. You've been a leader on water for so long, and I know I join many others in thanking you for your service. And I want to thank our attendees for this conversation. To pick up on this last question, if you are looking for resources to help you voice support for stimulus funds that can expand water infrastructure in more sustainable ways, take a look at our Stimulus for Sustainability Toolkit. You can find that on our website at www.waternow.org. You can also get there by clicking on the link in the chat box. It includes a template outreach letter and resolution, talking points, and a way to share your infrastructure story with us. And once again, I'm going to thank you in advance for completing the evaluation at the end of this webinar. A link to this survey is in the chat box, and we really appreciate it. And then finally, if you are a utility decision maker and not already a Water Now member, we invite you to join through the link in the chat and become part of our growing network of almost 700 water leaders in 39 states nationwide. Membership is free and gives you access to all sorts of resources and information that I'm sure you will find valuable and useful. We'll also follow up with an email and a link to the recording, as well as to the resources I've mentioned. So I want to thank Representative Huffman once again for his time, his extraordinary insights, and his service. And thanks to everybody for participating.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Take care.